Hey, it's Benji Cole, son of Al Cole from CBS Radio and host of the syndicated talk show People of Distinction, the talk that gives an in-depth view of some of the most dynamic, intelligent, and of course, successful people on the planet. Run to our website, peopleofdistinction.org, for more info, or you can always email me directly through benji@alcoleenterprises.com. And people, we are very excited to showcase this next guest here on our network, so do me a favor. Sit back, strap in, and get ready for a wonderful ride. And on the line with us today, we have Robert W. Thatcher, PhD. We're going to be discussing his amazing book, Beauty in the Brain, The Aesthetic Compass. Now, it's available for purchase through Amazon as well as barnesandnoble.com. But people, if you want to gather everything that Dr. Thatcher has in store, and I mean everything, because Dr. Thatcher has a lot in store, okay? Check out his personal website. It's called appliedneuroscience.com. There, you're going to gather more information on him, more information on this fantastic book. I mean, listen, just head to the website and you'll see what I'm talking about, because there's too many things to name. He has been putting in a lot of work, and it's a one-stop shop for everything that he has in store. So once again, that's appliedneuroscience.com. And before we go any further, I want to take this opportunity and point out that Dr. Thatcher was brought to our network, People of Distinction, today by one of the best advertising firms in the business. And people, you already know I'm talking about Quipper Prints. So listen to me. For my writers out there, if you have gone through your process, you have invested countless amounts of hours creating your narrative, and you finally have done it. You've completed it. You're at the end of the road, but you realize now you need help moving the book you just created. Well, if that's you, contact Quipper Prints. I'm telling you, they're one of the best in the business to do it, and this is exactly what they specialize in. So head on over to quipperprints.com today and gather all of the ways that their fantastic team is going to help you do just that. And listen, as I mentioned, it is a true pleasure. I mean, really an honor to have Dr. Thatcher here on the line. His book, Beauty in the Brain, is something magnificent. I mean, it really is something you're going to want to add to your shelf. And some of the topic points that we're going to cover today are going to get in depth, okay? It's going to get pretty scientific, but this book is not just for scientists. It's not just for neuroscientists. This is for the everyday person. This is for me. This is for you out there watching right now. He is going to analyze from a very scientific perspective what makes things beautiful. What is beauty? How do we categorize that? And what happens inside of our brain that draws us to that quote unquote beauty? And I'm promising you, it's something that you probably wouldn't have expected. I know I haven't, okay? When I started to read the book, I was blown away by certain aspects that he covers that really showcases how we are all connected, not only to each other, but also to this universe, and how the universe, in one way, shape, or form, is within us. I'm telling you, there's remarkable connections, and you have to stay tuned to discover all of it. And at the end of the day, Dr. Thatcher is the expert. I mean, truly, he is. He has spent years researching, analyzing, and developing equipment to really help us learn more about ourselves, to learn more about our brains. So he is more qualified than most to be able to articulate his position on this subject matter. Do me a favor, sit back and strap in, have your notebooks ready, because this is something you're going to want to be jotting down. And without further ado, let's jump right in. Dr. Thatcher, first and foremost, welcome to People of Distinction, and thank you very much for being a guest. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm great. Doing well.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Listen, I love what you're doing here. I think when it comes to perceived beauty, we know that we live in and I'll be the first to say it, we tend to live in a pretty narcissistic society, right? Where people want to be the center. They want to be quote unquote beautiful, and understanding it from a scientific perspective in terms of what is happening in the brain to really help acknowledge, quote, what is beauty and how it's perceived, I think is something special, man. And I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Before we jump into the book, let's learn a little bit more about your background. Who is Dr. Robert W. Thatcher?
Well, I started out as a math major at the University of Oregon. I went to University of Oregon on a baseball scholarship. Mm-hmm. And that I used to play in high school. Mm-hmm. But then I got injured actually after the first year, and I ended up then going into staying in math and then going into physics. And then I graduated eventually from the University of Oregon and with a major in chemistry. And then I looked around for something to do after graduating, and I took a course from Dr. Daniel Kimball, who's a brilliant, wonderful teacher in psychology. He was a neuropsychologist, mm-hmm. Physiological psychologist. And I learned about the brain, which I did not know much about. But he was such a good teacher, it just captured my imagination. And I wanted to know how this 2.5 pounds that's floating inside our skull and consumes 20 to 40% of our blood glucose, how it runs the show, how it gives us feelings and perception and awareness of self, awareness of others, the ability to talk and to remember. And so I got immersed in that, and then I went to graduate school in physiological psychology and ended up getting a PhD degree in physiological psychology, working with animals and putting implanted electrodes in animals. I then went to Albert Einstein College of Medicine as a postdoctoral fellow and would impale neurons. This is a very high-level institute at the medical school there, and published several papers. I evaluated the development of the brain from birth in kittens, from birth to 2 or 3 weeks of age, and could see how the thalamus, it's like the hub of a center of our brains, it communicates and how it maturates and develops. Mm-hmm. I then went to New York Medical College as an assistant professor with Dr. E. Roy John. I was in the Department of Psychiatry, and I taught medical students about the brain and worked in E. Roy John's laboratory where we imaged the brain in animals, primarily cats, but we also developed measuring the EEG from people and evaluating people who have, first normal people, but also people who have a history of neurological disorders, from schizophrenia to epilepsy to strokes to tumors, mm-hmm. to attention problems, a lot of things like that at New York Medical College and also NYU School of Medicine. I then went in 1980 to University of Maryland as a full professor in the Department of Psychiatry with a joint appointment at the University of Maryland Eastern Shore, where we evaluated the development of the brain from birth to 82 years of age and published a number of papers on that. We looked at both very healthy people, but also people who had problems along the way, so that we could see what the developmental difference is between healthy development of the brain and not so healthy. And once we understand, these parts of the brain, it makes it easier for us to help people. I then went to the National Institutes of Health as a project manager around 1990 for the Human Brain Project, where George Bush I put $2 billion into this huge program. And I was part of the team at the National Institutes of Health, where we developed new methods. It's called a PET scanner, a functional MRI, MRIs, 128-channel EEG. I was a project manager for that. We also use magnetic imaging of the brain, but we combined all these different imaging modalities. And in the early 1990s, we discovered the brain is actually made up of hubs. There's clusters of neurons. There's 44 on the left, 44 on the right. They were actually identified in 1909 based on the anatomy. These are hubs that actually have different classifications of neurons. The neurons have different connections, different types of neurons, and these 44 on the left, 44 on the right. And then we found at National Institutes of Health that these hubs are all talking to each other at high speeds. And so before 1990, we did not know the brain actually was made up of these hubs. We didn't, even though Corby and Brodmann discovered them anatomically, and was actually slicing brains and looking at cadaver brains of human beings in 1909, 1905, we could then see how these hubs work, how they talk to each other. Like the back of your head is for vision. There's clusters of neurons there. Your temporal lobes are involved in sound perception. Those are different clusters. Parts of your brain involved in movement. Those are different clusters. Then the frontal lobes have different clusters. But they're all talking to each other at very high speeds in milliseconds, and that's why you need to do EEG. A PET scan takes 20 minutes, and you got to do tasks to see these hubs light up. Mm-hmm. But if you measure the EEG, you see it in milliseconds of time, 200 milliseconds, 500 milliseconds. So there's a big advantage over EEG in terms of the time domain, because the brain is actually talking, these hubs are talking to each other. That became very well established. The second decade at the National Institutes of Health, another $2 billion went into it, and then the third decade, another $2 billion. But I then left the National Institutes of Health and went to work at the Bay Pines VA Medical Center, and also had an appointment at University of South Florida, Department of Neurology. I would teach medical students and postdoctoral fellows about the brain. And then in the year 2000, I created a company, 2001 actually, called Applied Neuroscience Incorporated. So it's been around for 23 years. We have over 2,000 customers where we sell software, no hardware, just software, to image the brain to help psychiatrists and neurologists, clinical psychologists, postdoctoral fellows, anybody who's interested in the brain. And now we have customers around the world. I mean, from in Europe to Australia to Korea to Japan and Indonesia, and then a lot, of course, inside the United States. And so we published a lot of papers on that and perfected the ability inexpensively to monitor the brain from birth to old age. And that's what I'm continuing to do. But along the way, when I was at New York Medical College, Eric Schwartz was a PhD in physics from Columbia University. My task was to teach Eric about the brain. He really wanted to learn about the brain. And after about a year or more, he came into my office and he was all excited. He said, I just read this paper that shows that the retina is a disc and it maps to the visual cortex, which is a rectangle. Eric is a physicist, and in the late 1800s, it was discovered that actually you could, in those days, the maps of the world were on a sphere inside of a boat, going around the world. Bernard Riemann is the name of this mathematician, and he found that you could unwrap the sphere and make it into a rectangle. And that way you could put it up on the wall of the boat and see immediately where you are on Earth and not have to turn the sphere around. And that's called a conformal map, I mentioned. And Eric Schwartz was expert as a physicist, because that turned out to be a very important map in physics later on in the early 1900s. But the fact that the brain actually had that, it's a spiral. The retina maps to it's a disc, maps to a rectangle. That actually is a logarithmic spiral. Just like you see for the galaxy shape, or a hurricane, or a snail shell. Then it's also found the inner ear, your cochlea, is also a logarithmic spiral. Mapping of your skin to the cortex, a straight line in your somatosensory cortex, spirals around your limbs. And so it's a logarithmic spiral. What's important about that, so all the senses are going through this common format. What's important is logarithms, you can do multiplication by addition. So when neurons communicate and they summate, they're actually doing multiplication. So the brain weighs 2.5 pounds, 3 pounds. It consumes 20 to 40% of our blood glucose, but it would take a computer the size of Rhode Island to do what that 2.5 pounds does. Because it doesn't do it the way a computer does. Okay? It does it by the actual flow of information from your retina, from your senses, through fibers, and through a logarithmic spiral, where it can do match and mismatch and comparisons of the present to the past in 50 milliseconds, 100 milliseconds, very fast. And that is the content of our consciousness, which happens in frames of about 150 to 300 milliseconds time for healthy people. Even though we're not aware of the fact that brain, we don't see the reality as being made up of a bunch of frames, it actually is. It's smoothed out because of the nature of the way our huge brain operates. But it's all transformed through a logarithmic spiral, which does the computations for us. And so it's foundational to our perception, to our memory, just by virtue of the shape of the brain. Now it happens to be, and that I noticed, and Eric Schwartz did too. Eric wrote a lot of papers on this, and all kinds of great things happen, is that beauty, the feeling of beauty, is immediately seized when you see a flowering plant that's radially going out, because the extreme of the spiral is concentric circles or radial lines. Or if you see anything that's spiraling in the water, in the ocean, you just get immediate relaxation. You get the immediate feeling of aesthetics and beauty without thinking. You elaborate, that's stage one, that you can go on to explore the nature of that feeling of beauty. But the feeling of beauty comes with simplicity, with an immediate recognition. It's subconscious. It's a matching of the form of the brain with the form of things external to our brains. And so when that match happens, we get a feeling of beauty. The human body itself actually follows the golden proportion. That has been shown by artists in the late 1400s and 1500s. If you look at the ratio of the top of the head to the chin, and then the chin to your waist, that ratio is the golden proportion ratio. The golden proportion ratio is roughly 1/3, 2/3 of things, but it's not exactly like that. It's close to that. So you see, the human body itself has got these forms, which gives rise to the feeling of beauty because it matches the shapes and the mappings of the brain itself.
Dr. Thatcher, thank you very much for that. Listen, man, we're going to have to invite you back on the network, okay? Because there is so much content that is confounded in this book, but also your background is amazingly impressive. And of course, you lived it, so you know how impressive it truly is. People, I'm telling you, we could not have selected the more perfect embodiment of a person of distinction to be on the network with us. One thing that I took amongst all of that he said, is this is the right man for the job, okay? When we're talking about dissecting beauty from a scientific standpoint and what is happening in the brain to give that perception, this man is well suited to answer that question and to go in depth with it. I love it. There's so much happening here. You know what you got to do. Let's jump right in. I want to know about inspiration. I think it's safe to assume, Dr. Thatcher, why you would want to explore beauty from a scientific standpoint in which you do. Again, given your background, how much experience you have analyzing the brain, but I want to hear it from you when it comes to this book, Beauty and the Brain. What inspired you to embark upon this journey?
Well, I guess, my background in physics, where you can see galaxies spinning, but when you see that actually is inside the brain, and those forms and shapes are there, which is universal. So it's like part of the universe is inside of our skulls. When you actually see that, it's a mystery to a neuroscientist like me. You wonder, what is that? And then you study it further, you see that all primates have this. Cats have half of their retina is a spiral, and another half that goes through a different part of the brain is it's called the Euclidean map. It's just straight, doesn't spiral. That is computational neuroanatomy, actually. So our anatomy is doing computations. And it's a mystery about what that is. And when you're a scientist, you're working with the brain, and it has to do with beauty, it's extremely intriguing. And so in 1985, I wrote a chapter on this topic. Actually, it forms the basis of the book that I did now. Now, I submitted that chapter to the publisher, actually is an editor of the book, and the book was getting too big, and that my chapter was too long, so he said, well, unfortunately, I won't be able to include it in the book. Mm-hmm. But I retained all that information, and I went on doing other things. I mentioned National Institutes of Health and all kinds of things. But now that I'm at the stage I am in life, I just started to retrieve. I have a large stack of things on this. I've always enjoyed this relationship between the spiral structure of the mappings in our brain and the spiral structure of the universe, and knowing that when those come together, you get a feeling of beauty, the shape and form. It's a golden proportion is what it is, proportion of 1/3, 2/3. And that feeling of beauty comes immediately. It's also in music. Beethoven, Bach, or particularly Beethoven, has a whole thing on how the beauty of the brain is least beautiful in terms of the form of the music with the golden proportion. So there's many examples of beautiful things in music and art and the feelings we get when we look out at the stars and the universe that come immediately without thinking. It just comes immediately. So that was a mystery to me. I wanted to understand it better, and I explored it in fair detail, going through the scientific literature, looking at these maps of the brain, which are in the book. I actually showed these maps and the discoveries that were made on the way the retina maps and the ears and the skin and all that, and then elaborate that to link it to the reality of our lives, which involves where healthy people are directed towards things that are beautiful. It gives us good feelings, it gives us calmness, it gives us purpose, and it satisfies our hearts. So that drove me as a neuroscientist to just immerse myself in that and understand it better.
Yeah. Dr. Thatcher, a follow-up question, because I believe I'm picking up what you're putting down. Okay. And by no means, I am not a scientist. Okay. I don't have a background in science. I'm a creative person. Now, my wife is a physician. This is something probably right up her alley. She loves those sciences and things that way. But what I'm hearing, if I'm not mistaken, is that when it comes to the perception of beauty, you mentioned the golden proportion. Are you saying that universally, we as individuals all have the same type of things that we categorize as beauty, meaning there is a connection or a scientific approach? I guess the question that I'm trying to put into words here, when it comes to my wife, for instance, here I am, I thought that I had a particular type of woman that I was searching out. And when it came to her and how beautiful she is, I viewed it as this is something that I perceive beauty to be, and that is unique to me. Are you saying, based upon the golden proportion, that beauty is something that actually is pretty synonymous amongst everyone?
It's universal, and it comes immediately without thought. When you see something beautiful, it could be a sunset, it could be a flower, tree, things that are moving in the universe with simplicity, and the key to it is least energy, least effort, because that's the beauty actually comes from simplicity. things that balance, but also that particular ratio of the golden proportion is unique in the universe. Mathematically, it gives rise to a particular number. It's an irrational number that's very, very unique in the universe. Just taking the ratio of the 1/3, 2/3. This is not exactly that, but it's very close to that. Mm-hmm. That is an irrational number in mathematics. It goes to infinity, but it's a very special number in the universe because it's minimal energy. It's one of those things that water going down a hill, for example, minimal energy as it finds the path of least resistance. That's happening all the time in our lives. I mean, obviously people have complicated lives and you can't do it all the time, but that's part of the reason why people go to the seashore. Most people try to live on the seashore or in mountains. They live where there are lakes, they live in nature. Because nature is always following this minimal energy force to essentially keep us together in a way in the universe.
That is incredible. People, I'm telling you, I am fascinated by what we are discussing here. I know you all are as well. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, AppliedNeuroscience.com. That's where you got to go. Pick up your copies of Beauty and the Brain, The Aesthetic Compass by Robert W. Thatcher, PhD. This is something you're going to want to add to your shelf because I'm truly fascinated by what we're talking about. I thought, again, as I mentioned a moment ago with the example that I utilized with my wife, here I am thinking that I am unique in this. And really, she is just beautiful by universal standards. I mean, this is incredible stuff. I love what we're talking about here. My follow-up question to you, Dr. Thatcher, this, of course, so far, in terms of what we've talked about, we're analyzing things from a scientific perspective. So the information that we have been covering seems like it might be geared specifically to neuroscientists. Now, I want to give you this opportunity to dispel any preconceived notions here. Who would you say is your intended reader for this book?
It's actually not so much neuroscientists. Maybe they would do it. Mm-hmm. But the first chapter, I try to actually encapsulate the entire book in the first chapter. So you don't have to read too much beyond that. It gives you an introduction. But it's to anybody that wants to understand in greater depth why we're attracted towards things that are beautiful, mm-hmm. why we move in the direction of least effort and least conflict and simplicity and harmony. Why do those things cause us to guides our lives? And the answer to that is because the brain it resonates. It operates best when there's simplicity of that physical form, that shape, and it gives rise to feelings of pleasure, which then guides us to move in those directions. Mm-hmm. And as you start to learn music, you get a little bit more, better. Depends what you're doing. If you're playing piano, but you get the right harmonies and the right sequences, and you feel good. You know how you're playing the music. It affects you. It guides you subconsciously because it's approaching the golden proportion, that ratio.
It's really interesting, especially the concept when it comes to music. I am not a musician, but my father is and has been. But I've always had a weird connection with music and utilizing it in my own way as a therapeutic process in certain times, right? Getting me through certain moments that may be difficult, certain moments where I'm really happy and enjoying what is happening. But music has always had this interesting way of connecting. And again, it's hard to articulate in words, but you just know it when it happens. And this is kind of what you're talking about in that connection that you're establishing. I'm fascinated by all of this. I'm curious to know, Dr. Thatcher, throughout this entire process, what would you say was a highlight for you? Or if not a highlight, maybe something that surprised you that you weren't anticipating before you began?
Well, just being able to see the spiral itself. I mean, in 1977, 1980, through that period, you could literally go through the scientific literature and see that the cochlea is a spiral, the retina maps to the lateral geniculate as a spiral, touch is a spiral, and it's just a mystery. And it's a golden proportion. See, it's a ratio of 2/3, 1/3. That's so unique in the universe, which is minimal energy. So my history in physics, minimal energy is absolutely essential for what's going on in the universe. That's very foundational in the history of physics to understand that. In late 1800s, early 1900s, and Einstein built on that too. It forms the foundation for much of physics, because the universe actually is ordered that way. It evolves and changes that way. So I could see that the brain is like a mini universe. It's got these spirals in it. It's got these galaxies in it. And it's matching the external world. And when it does, we get a feeling of beauty and calmness and motivation to experience it more. So that combination of personal experience with those forms and the mystery of that being in the brain, and then seeing its minimal energy, and it's guiding us in the direction towards greater mental health, actually, and better relationships with others, that intrigued me and caused me to, continue to explore it and think about it, then try to write it, express it in a way that's digestible to people, not heavily mathematical.
Right. Dr. Thatcher, this is incredible. We know about your background. We know about this wonderful book. I'm focusing now on the future. What's upcoming? What's next for you?
Well, I'm just going to, hopefully this book will do well. But right now we're doing great things to help people with various disorders. People use our software. They measure the EEG, the electrical energies of the brain, and then they can combine it with we use a template MRI from the National Institutes of Health and the Montreal Neurological Institute. So the form, actually the structural form, is being matched. And when we can see that, both the form and the way that information is flowing from the hubs, we can help people. We can help children that have attention deficit disorders. We see the attention network. We can see people have balance problems. We can see the cerebellum and Parkinsonism and things like this, and try to reinforce the synapses, the connections between these parts of the brain, to move people in the direction of greater health. And so we image the brain electrically, and also they combine it with the MRI, and that's what our over 2,000 customers do, the neurologists, psychologists, psychiatrists, graduate students, to help their patients. Because once they can link the patient's symptoms to problems of dysregulation in the various hubs, then they can target those hubs and do biofeedback or magnetic or electrical stimulation and move those hubs in the direction of greater health. So it's important for me to continue to do that and to expand the company. I mean, we get a lot of interest, and we're expanding all the time. A lot of interest in Japan and Korea and Indonesia recently, and we're going to be traveling to Australia. We already have customers in Australia, but we're going to try to expand that further, because it helps people. You can image the brain, and you can do things to reinforce the brain towards greater health, greater stability, and that changes the lives of people.
As we start to close out, we've discussed a lot. I know we've covered so much, and here's the wonderful thing, people. We've barely scratched the surface. We've touched up on so much, and we're only at the tip of the iceberg. There's a lot more that you're going to want to uncover once you pick up copies of the book. But as we close out, Dr. Thatcher, is there anything that we haven't touched up on that you really want to make sure our listening audience here is aware of?
Well, one interesting thing that's been happening for a while is in athletics, peak performance. For pitchers, for example, the second, third inning, if they don't pay attention, one pitch, and then it's a home run, and they're in trouble. So they need to be able to control their thinking and focus, or athletes that are peak performers who run. There's ways to make sure that they're doing that in the sort of a golden proportion way, where the energy of their legs and arms moves in the right direction. Or people that are playing golf, staying calm and focused. So from baseball and football to archery, it's applied to help people and younger people too to become better athletes. And so in addition to the clinical side, where you can help people who have movement disorders and attention problems, you can also help younger people and professional athletes too, to have to be more calm, to be more focused, and to be able to be more agile and to be more precise in their movements. So that's another application that is positive.
This is something that I'm telling you, people, listen, this is the precipice of something magical. It starts with this book, and I'm gonna hone it in. All right, before I really start to dive down the rabbit hole, Beauty in the Brain is the book you need to pick up. Amazon, Barnes & Noble, AppliedNeuroscience.com. It's where you gotta go. Pick up your copies today by Robert W. Thatcher, PhD. You can thank me later because this is something you're gonna want to add to your shelf. While you're learning about it, you can dive down that rabbit hole yourself and start to understand those connections, because I'm telling you, it's going to be a journey that you're not going to want to get off. Okay, this is going to be something that is going to open your eyes to so much. Head on over there today, pick up your copies, and get lost in all of it. Dr. Thatcher, this has been a true pleasure, an absolute enlightening process. Thank you once again for being a guest on People of Distinction.
Well, same here. Thank you.